Hello, everyone. If we're to look at tragedy, if we're to seriously consider it, we're going to need to think about the culture that it came from and what are the underpinnings of that culture. Tragedy begins in. Sorry, there's a weird clapping noise, despite the fact that I'm recording this on a Saturday, and it's definitely not 8 p.m. either. Um, Tragedy begins with the ancient Greeks. We're going to look in our next lecture about precisely when these plays are written, but there's something quite stable about the culture of and the religions of ancient Greece during this time period. So we're going to start with that. The gods of ancient Greece and the mythology surrounding them is a subject which is taught loosely in primary school and then rarely, if ever, touched on in state secondary schools. Some schools have it in their year 7 and never go back to it. A lot of schools never have it at all. And this is a real shame, as understanding the Greek relationship with their gods is fundamental to understanding Greek culture and civilization, which is in turn fundamental to understanding all Western civilizations, including our own. Because our literature, our theatre, our laws, our culture, our government, our philosophy, our science, our mathematics, our understanding of love, and our language is all inherited from those ancient Greek forebears. And that's rooted in a religion which is both labyrinthine, extraordinarily complex, and also curiously sensible. The Greeks did not believe, as the Abrahamic religions do, in a loving or just God. Rather, seeing the state of their world, they came up with a pantheon, a group of gods, who were often vain, spiteful, angry, lustful, abusive, and violent. The Greeks imagined gods, essentially, who were like them. When their gods interfered in human affairs, it was sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, but it was always driven by the gods' whims. Strangely enough, our common expressions seem to imply we believe this too. If one's house is destroyed by a hurricane, it's said to be an act of God, which means you were just unlucky. And yet we will still attempt to reconcile that with a God who loves us, but moves in mysterious ways. For the Greeks, it's simpler. It's an act of a God who doesn't do it because they're expressing their love via other ways. It's a God who does it because he or she feels like it, and he or she can. They imagine humans given huge amounts of power, and within that spectrum of good or evil provided by humanity, we see the spectrum of good or evil provided by the gods. Christian, especially Catholic arts, suggests that those gods of the ancient Greeks and their relationship is quite recognisable to us. Partly this is a legacy of the Renaissance, in which Italian Catholic art of the sort of 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, certainly very early 17th century, is heavily modelled on the art of ancient Greece. But every Cupid or cherub you see painted in a church is actually an Erotes. The Erotes are the siblings of Eros and the children of the goddess of love, Aphrodite. If you see the blindfolded Lady of Justice outside the law courts, a sword and a scales in each hand, that's a tribute to Athena, who assembled the first ever jury to try a case. That's the case of Orestes for murdering his mother, which is told in sorry, that really threw me. Told in Aeschylus's Orestia. Because Greek gods were not fair, it was vitally important to stay on the right side of them. Sometimes this was impossible. The Greeks attributed the Trojan War to a disagreement between three goddesses over who was the most beautiful. And that itself was a fight created by the goddess Ares, who was the goddess of discord and disharmony, who was herself upset about not being invited to a wedding feast. And in this rivalry between the three goddesses as to who is the most beautiful, it was impossible for humans to avoid upsetting at least some of the gods. A human is called on to judge which goddess is the most beautiful, and that human is Paris. The punishment for judging one goddess more beautiful than the other two is to have his city burnt to the ground on the guidance and with the enabling of two goddesses who were not chosen. Most gods, however, are fortunately a bit easier to please. Poseidon, the god of the sea, called Neptune by the Romans, as in notice Neptune in My Last Duchess, can be bought off with alcohol. The naming ceremony of any new boat involves a ritual to the god. This is absolutely true, and is true to this day. And that ritual culminates in the breaking of a bottle of wine over the boat as a gift to Poseidon, hoping he will grant the boat passage in his watery kingdom. This ritual is still of the utmost importance to mariners, and Her Majesty the Queen can be found in Portsmouth at the launch of each new Royal Navy ship, where she breaks a bottle of champagne on its hull as her gift to a god who has always looked favourably on her country. This is the head of the Church of England sacrificing wine in honour of a Greco-Roman god of the sea. There is a further ritual to be performed when crossing the equator, and in this ritual, 2 glasses of rum are poured into the sea, one for each hemisphere that the boat is thankful for protection in. I know of no sailor who neglects this duty, from the smallest yacht to the largest oil tanker. All will give libation to Neptune on crossing the equator. In theatre, the god we're concerned with is Dionysus. Dionysus, who was called Bacchus by the Romans, was the god of wine, fertility, poetry, which includes theatre, and the Dionysian ritual. The Dionysian ritual is not well understood, but appears to be a multi-day drink and possibly drug-fueled orgy in which participants would have profound spiritual visions as well as more earthly pleasures. If you'd like a book which uses the Dionysian ritual as its sort of central premise, can I suggest Donna Tartt's book, The Secret History, which is an absolute masterpiece of university-centred fiction. These orgies may have been aided by the fact that the ancient Greeks seem to have had access to a form of birth control called Silphium, which was a plant that was so popular that it's led to its own extinction around 100 or 200 BC. The god Dionysus was twice born. So he was killed early on and then resurrected. You can see the parallels. And he demanded tribute in the form of blood. However, it's not the literal spilling of blood that Dionysus wished for. And the Greeks did not go for human sacrifice. And there are reasons which probably underpin the success of their civilization, for their rejection of human sacrifice, which was actually common in other religions around that time, and cultures which predated the Greeks. But instead, Dionysus demands the spilling of symbolic blood. And the bloodshed, the symbolic blood, is the inevitable consequences of the theatrical genre known as tragedy. Tragedies, then, are actually a form of religious ritual. Tragedies held a huge role in Greek culture. They were the acknowledged masterpieces of Greek culture. They held roles as a social celebration. They were propaganda pieces to demonstrate the brilliance and divine inspiration of Athenian civilization. And of course, they were also religious rituals. And they were all of these things at once. The Dionysia was an annual festival which began in the 6th century BC and centered on a contest between three playwrights who would each present three tragedies over the course of 3 days. All citizens of Athens would gather to watch these plays, with the expectation that tremendously well constructed, emotionally gripping, and importantly bloody plays would best please Dionysus. This annual festival continued for around 300 years, until the 2nd century BC. And while relatively few tragedies from this festival survive, those that do are superb, and they're still performed to this day. They still retain the power to grip and move modern audiences. One would hope that Dionysus, should he appear to cast judgment on the London theatre scene when it reopens someday after this trouble is behind us, Dionysus casting judgment on London theatre would be suitably impressed to see that plays created for him and the countless subsequent plays inspired by his festivals, including the 2 plays you studied at GCSE and the 2 plays you will study at A-level, existing side by side in a tapestry of bloody murder which spans from Hammersmith Lyric in the west to Theatre Royal Stratford in the east, a river of catharsis that heals God and men alike. The Greek gods were like us. Dionysus, perhaps more so than some. And what was pleasing to them is pleasing to us. Thank you very much.